The Too Cool t-shirt quilt method's great for making other types of quilts. We can make what I call sew-down quilts. Those would be necktie quilts, hanky quilts, doily quilts, any type of quilt that you have something that you can sew on a block and then make into a quilt just like you would a t-shirt quilt. This video will only look at the unique aspects of using this system to make other types of quilts. I'll be referring to information that's available in our standard t-shirt quilt video series. If you haven't watched our basic series, I would suggest that you do so. When planning your sew-down quilt, your first step is to decide on your color palette. For example, if you're making a hanky quilt, you may want to use all white blocks. Here's some examples of different color palettes you might think. You may have a color palette where there's just 3 different colors. You could use a color palette that's all one color, but different shades of that color. You may choose a color palette that's all pastel colors, or you may choose a color palette that's totally random. It's up to you. It depends on what you're doing, what your customer wants, and what you're putting on these blocks. The next step, cut your blocks from your palette and then mount your items. I'm going to show you a number of items that we can use to make a sew-down quilt, but don't let yourself be limited just to these items. You can use this method for any type of sew-down quilt with anything you can wash. Now I'm going to demonstrate the sewing and cutting for 4 different types of quilts. Doily quilts. When you're cutting your doilies, be creative with them. Figure out something that's more than just each doily on its own individual block. When you sew down your doilies, you may notice on some of them that there's not a lot of fabric on the edge. Do your best just to sew along the edge. If there's really not enough room, you may need to move your stitches in. Now it's time to do the long arm quilting. 2 things to remember. 1, when you do a sew-down quilt, you don't have any wide open blocks that you can do a design in. And 2, each block will have something lumpy and thick in it. Now, as I move on to the center of this block, I may have some trouble because there's really big, wide open loops here that my hopping foot can get stuck in. So my solution to that is a piece of paper. I take a piece of paper that I'm going to sew over, and I'm going to lay it on top of the loops. When you're finished quilting, this paper will rip right off because you've perforated it. So after you finish quilting, you rip off the paper. When you're cutting your neckties, have fun. Just don't put them all on up and down. Play with it and make a cool design. When you're sewing down your neckties, find a matching color thread. When you're quilting a necktie quilt, one of the most difficult parts is not coming off the necktie, but it's going onto the necktie. Because when you go on, you may push up the edge of the necktie and it will be bent over. So you need to use both your fingers to spread that flat. So when your hopping foot goes over the necktie, it doesn't sew the edge up. When I make a hanky quilt, I take the opportunity to fold the hankies in all sorts of different ways. It makes for a much more interesting quilt. When you quilt a hanky quilt, I would suggest that you quilt it in white or off-white thread. Visually, hankies are very delicate, and if you use a dark colored thread, all you're going to see is that thread and not the hankies. When you're quilting your hanky quilt, you can use geometric patterns, or you can use the actual hankies for clues of what you want to do. So if you see a flower on a hanky, you could trace that. If you have a loose area on one of your hankies, make sure you don't sew it down or sew it all down. You need to decide to do one or the other. But as you're going onto this area, make sure you know that it's going to move on you. When you're cutting your bibs, don't feel like they all have to be perfect. Have fun. Put them at an angle, skew them. It's more interesting to have something to look at that's just not perfect bibs one after another. When quilting a baby bib quilt, you're going to have trouble getting onto the bib. So I would suggest that you begin on the bib, do a design, and then jump off and do the rest of the block. If you're worried about a bib being real thick, check it first before you take your machine onto it. I know I'm going to have some really thick spots and I'm going to want to slow down so the machine can get through them better. Quilting a baby hat quilt can be difficult because of the difference in the hats and the base fabric. The hats are taller and this is flatter. You need to see if your hopping foot can get on and off the baby hat easily. So let's look at this blue one here. I'm on, but look how much it's pushing. It's pushing, pushing, and I'm getting stuck. It's very difficult. This is going to be a really hard one to sew. I'm only going to do a little bit of stitching. And that's all the stitching I'm going to do on that block. Let's look at this hat here. It's really raised up above the fabric. So let's move our hopping foot over and see what happens when we move it over there without the machine on. Up, see right there. It pushed that right there, which tells me it's going to be really hard to get this hopping foot onto this without pushing the fabric. So if I really want to quilt this, I'm going to have to start on. So I'm going to move my thing on and let's see what happens when I'm on. Oh, lots of pushing, pulling. I'm going to get this all caught up in here. This is going to be really, really miserable to quilt. So I'm not going to quilt very much of it. I might quilt around his face and that will hold it down. And that's all the quilting I'm going to do on this entire hat. I'll quilt around it, but nothing else on the hat.